So welcome to Box Folder Fonz, Teaching Archival Literacy. We've got 4 panelists here today. Emily and I will be co-moderating. And just before we introduce ourselves, I want to give a very brief introduction to the term archival literacy. And with apologies to people who have much more experience with this than I do, I'll say that I did a quick literature review this morning to see, okay, how is this term used and how long has it been in circulation? So I'm finding articles from 2014 and 2015. There was a series of 2 articles in American Archivists called Archival Literacy for History Students. And there was also a study of archivists in Slovenia and Bosnia in 2014 that used the term archival literacy. There's a definition in the opening chapter of SAA's Teaching with Primary Sources, the chapter by Elizabeth Yackel and Doris Malkmus. That was in 2016. And in 2018, it looks like the idea of archival literacy was baked into the ACRL SAA guidelines for primary source literacy. So the 2 terms I think are kind of intertwined, and I think sometimes they might be used interchangeably. So I don't have any kind of prescribed definition for archival literacy, but I think that that's something we'll be getting at today. So with that kind of humble disclaimer, let us all introduce ourselves as panelists. Emily, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Sure thing. So hi, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of TPS Fest. My name is Emily Beran. I am the Research and Instruction Librarian in the Division of Rare Manuscript Collections at Cornell University. And I'm going to turn it over to Melissa.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Melissa Chim. I am the Scholarly Communications Librarian over at Excelsior University. I'll pass it on to Samantha.
Hi, everyone. My name is Samantha Summerbell. I'm the lead archivist here at the Annenberg School for Communications at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm also an adjunct faculty member for the University of North Texas, where I teach arrangement and description for library students.
And I am Jill Piekut-Roy, Special Collections Librarian at University of Southern Maine. So I believe Emily has our first question.
Yeah, so just kind of giving a little overview. We are doing this very informally, but kind of want to give a chance for all of our panelists to speak to ideas that they've encountered in their own work, and also get people thinking before we open Q&A up after a little bit. So if you've got thoughts on any of these, please leave them in the chat or let us know about it when we get time for a conversation and things as well. So just to start us off real nice and basic, when did you first start to consider archival literacy?
I will kick us off here. As an archivist, I've actually only been here at UPenn's Annenberg for about a year. The last 18 years I taught or I worked in archives all around Texas, and we've done the usual traditional show and tell, working with faculty and teaching students, how to work with these types of materials. But I was approached here at Annenberg by some of the students wanting to know more about the behind the scenes work with archives and understanding some of the more critical components of the work that we do and how it affects the materials that they're using, and a deeper understanding of archives. So that was what I kind of transferred my focus from teaching about the materials and researching to taking the skills that I was teaching archivist in library school and giving that kind of instruction to the communication students that we had here at UPenn. And I'll talk more about the workshop as we progress through these questions.
I could jump in next. The first time I really started to consider it was when I was a student myself. When I was going to library school, I was actually interning at the Brooklyn Historical Society under their archivist. And that was the first time I really started to think about archival literacy, just like from my own professional standpoint, in the sense that, okay, I myself am learning how to use the archives, and how can I teach other people how to use the archives too? At the time, I was going to St. John's University, and when I was getting my MLIS, I was doing archives and academic libraries. And so like the big thing, of course, in academic libraries is information literacy. And so like learning about archival literacy and information literacy in tandem was something that I really took to my later jobs. I was an archivist over at General Theological Seminary before coming over here to Excelsior. And right now I don't work in the traditional archive. I do the institutional repository, but a lot of the same principles apply, I found.
My first job as an archivist was not in academia, so I was working as an archivist for a local public library history room, and so I found myself having to teach the concepts of archives to quite a few people, to volunteer staff, to users, to my director, and so I think I was thinking of archival literacy before I was exposed to the concept of primary source literacy. And it wasn't until I was interviewing for my current position as an instructor that I studied up on primary source literacy. So for me, the two have been intertwined for as long as I've known about both of them. My question for the panelists is, I'm wondering if you can define the difference between archival literacy and primary source literacy and how you distinguish those two, whether you're talking to a faculty member or a student or a supervisor.
I'll go ahead. This is going to be a very random example, but a lot of times when I think about primary source literacy and think about archival literacy, I often think of it in the, I say all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares kind of thing. Because there's a lot of aspects about archival literacy that very, very heavily intersect with primary source literacy. Because archives, as primary sources. So there's a lot that overlaps, there's a lot that intersects, but there's also things within primary source literacy that don't always apply to archives. So when we teach students about, printed published sources, think like newspapers and things like that, the way that they might need to interact with them, the way that they would search for them and request them from catalogs and things like that is going to look a little different than working with archival boxes and those types of material. So for me, it's very, very interconnected, but yeah, not everything applies across both spectrums kind of thing, if that makes sense.
I'll jump in next. To kind of mention the way I interpret it more, primary source literacy is you're teaching more about the materials and the creators and how to get students to those materials perhaps and how they interpret the content of those materials. And when I'm considering something like archival literacy, it's the behind the scenes factors that affect our understanding of those materials. So how do institutional collecting policies affect the scope of the material, and does that create biases or silences within the materials that these students are learning? How do the professional standards that archivists use affect the material that we're looking at? So does the metadata standards change how we look at some of these resources and what we can interpret, and would it look different in a community archive versus a institution like a university or a public library? Or how do personal archives factor into that? And it's all those different nuances that affect the context and the creation of these materials, our interpretation of it. So for me, archival literacy is more of like a top view and looking at all of the little webs that connect all of these different concepts and policies and procedures, and how that can shape our understanding of the primary sources that these students are looking at.
I 100% agree with Samantha and Emily on those. I think those are both like perfect definitions. One other thing that I would add just between the two is I think primary source literacy can be diversified a little bit more in the sense that not only history students use primary sources, they're found also in things like nursing, social sciences, and other disciplines like that. Whereas with archival literacy, no matter what the archive actually holds, what the theme of the archive is, if it's in an academic institution or a public library, there's still standards that are followed Whereas when you're doing searching, even just searching for primary sources, your search strategies will be a little bit different depending on the discipline that you're in.
So kind of moving away from our ideas about what is archival literacy and kind of talking a little bit more about experience. So before I get to the question, I'll just mention I really come from more of like a rare books background. And so working with archival collections and doing this more archival literacy thing is something that I feel like I've had to learn a lot because of requests coming in for classes and stuff that I work with for a lot of our archival material. So my experience has been really like boots on the ground, like learn as you go in some ways. And that's part of why I was also really interested in participating in this panel is kind of one, providing that more novice perspective in some ways, but also giving the opportunity to like learn from people who do this more and things like that. So kind of couching all of that. If the rest of the panelists could talk a little bit about their experience teaching archival literacy and maybe some of the particular projects that they've done, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll kick it off. As I mentioned, I'd only been here at the Annenberg for about a year, and communications is definitely a new field for me. I primarily worked with obviously the humanities, the histories. My background, master's, was in history. So I'm still trying to get my brain around the field of communications as a study and an area of academia. But I was approached about a month after I started here by a doctoral student in our program here who wanted a workshop on archives. I scheduled a meeting with her to kind of get an understanding of what she was interested in, and she just wanted to have more of this discussion of what are archives and to dive deep into these critical archival theories. And so we actually worked together for a couple months developing what became a 5-part workshop series for the spring semester that we opened up to Annenberg doctoral students. And shockingly, we had 30 students register within the first day we opened the registration. So there was obviously a big interest in looking at archives through this critical lens. And so what we developed were the 5 sessions. First one was just kind of like a brainstorming introduction. What do you want to learn from archives? How do we define archives? And that was a very interesting kind of launching point for us, because then we used that to kind of tailor. We met each week to kind of digest that workshop for that week and tailor the next one to their interest and what they wanted to learn from archives based on their own experiences and using it. And so then our second one, we looked at archival processing and finding aids. So not a deep dive like I would do with arrangement and description for archive students, but to give them a general overview of the interventions archivists perform on materials and how that kind of shapes what they can access and use online or in a library or in an archives, and those fundamental principles that guide archival processing. The third one we looked at was context and history. So where does this archival trend stem from? Where is the direction that we're going now, from like custodial models to post-custodial models, and the ethics behind all of that? We had a session on research techniques and how do you approach research in an archives? How do you use different tools like Tropy and different things that they could use for their own research? How do you build your own digital archive? So that was more of a hands-on session. And then for the last session, we actually polled them and said, what do you want to talk about for archival futures and ethics, which we ended up doing repatriation, reparative description work, and deaccession policies, because they were interested in what that looks like between types of institutions and how that affects materials and what's available, what's not available, what's missing in those archival silences. So we ran a big scope of different topics within this archival literacy, but it was a program that was built from the student interest here at the Annenberg School. And there was a lot of wonderful participation through all 5 of those sessions there. So I'll turn it over to the next panelist.
So I've had the wonderful good fortune of working with a colleague in our reference and instruction department in our library. And her name is Megan McGregor. And she has been very interested in the LGBTQ plus collection that's part of our special collections as a researcher and also as a librarian. So we've collaborated on a couple of like one-shot sessions, and specifically a sociology methods class where the students actually came in 3 times. So we had an opportunity to think about how we were teaching them information literacy, primary source literacy, and there I don't know exactly how it happened, but we also started to think about archival literacy, partly because the students were required to do a research project. They were doing project-based learning. So they needed the skills, not just to understand the resources that were available, but to locate and contextualize the resources that were available. Through our collaboration, Megan and I also did some archival literacy instruction for the Maine Library Association, which led to a couple of public library visits. Actually really, really fun and exciting for the audience, where we brought primary source instruction into the public library and focused quite a bit on context and the relationship between the materials that we were sharing in order to create the history, which was kind of Megan's part. And through that, we also were able to collaboratively teach a course called Queer Archives at College of the Atlantic, which was an undergraduate course, kind of focusing on everything around queer archives, including archives practice, which was my angle. So I had the wonderful experience this spring of teaching undergraduates some of the basic elements of archives practice, which really has changed the way that I think about instruction sessions. I believe we still need to hear from Melissa.
Oh, thank you. In my experience, kind of teaching archival literacy has been very individualized. In my old job at the seminary, I was a one-person library, so I had to do archival work, but then of course also reference and everything else that comes with the library work. So I found that when I taught, it was very individualized. We did have those one-shot courses coming in. Associate courses on things like Old Testament, New Testament, that would take a look at our Bibles. So during those courses, I would allow the students to actually interact with the materials. But it was with the graduate students that I was able to do more individual archival literacy. There were many students that wanted to incorporate archival material into their dissertations. And so on those one-on-one interactions, I would teach them how to use the archive. I would show them the finding aid I was working from. I would show them how to use how to search the archives through our catalog. So it was in those like very small moments that I found that I was teaching archival literacy. I wish I had that opportunity to do it on a more wider scale. At my current job, I kind of do. I'm in charge of the information literacy course here, and we just did a major revision. So I made sure to add more things related to primary source literacy. I also included a section on archival literacy, just introducing them to the concepts like finding aids and things like that.
So we've heard from the panelists about some of the more serendipitous or relational reasons why they have ventured into teaching archival literacy. One that I didn't share is actually it's a strategic motivation, which is that our university also has a very well-known map library that offers primary source instruction sessions and does a phenomenal job. So in some ways I'm in competition with them as much as I love those colleagues. And so one of the reasons why I choose to focus on archival literacy in instruction is because it differentiates our special collections instruction services from the other instruction services that are offered on our campus. But I also have some personal reasons for wanting to teach archival literacy. My family background is in local government and civic engagement. And so I've witnessed how an ability to find and understand documents and how they relate to each other has a real impact on civic engagement. So that's my personal motivation for teaching archival literacy. So I'm curious to know from our panelists, what are some of your more personal motivations for diving into this topic?
I'll say my first or my master's was in history, and I want to say I didn't set foot in archives until after I'd already completed that degree. So it's one of those things. Personally, I wish I had this exposure when I was doing my master's, because I think I would have had a much easier time. I could have done much more robust work myself if I had had any understanding of what an archives is. And that is not like an uncommon situation that we see all the time dealing with special collections and archives. And I've done many years of teaching archives to archivists and to librarians. So the idea of getting to teach those concepts to other disciplines was really exciting. And the fact that I was approached by a student who was so pumped and so excited about archives, even though she had no real grounding or background in that, really motivated me to kind of develop something that she would enjoy and that would be useful to a communications scholar here at Annenberg. And then after we'd done all of these different workshops and sessions, the success stories that came out of it were motivating for us to keep going with this work. As part of the session that we did on how to do research and tips and tricks for archives, we talked about like research grants and travel grants, things I never knew about as a master's student that I wish I had. And we ended up with a couple students who received travel grants at the end. They had applied through the course of the workshop to go and visit archives and get these travel grants, and they actually won funds to go and visit like the Rockefeller Foundation archives up in New York and a couple over in Germany, which was just really exciting and a tangible outcome that we could approach our stakeholders and our dean with and say, look, there's obviously an interest from our students here. They're doing great things with what they're taking away from our workshop. So we can count this as like a big success. But like I said, it's just things I wish I knew growing up and going through academia and higher ed, or even just personal research. It's like I said, I love helping anyone find information about archives. I love doing talks about different topics that you can find in archives, but actually getting to talk about archives and what I do is what I could do all day long. So I will use any excuse to talk about archives.
I'm pretty similar myself too. My first master's is also in history, and I actually got a chance to do some archival research when I was getting my degree. I was able to go to a couple of archives in London. I went to the BFI Institute archives and all those fun things. And so that really sparked my interest too. It was funny because when I was getting my master's degree in history, I thought I would work in museums. And then when I kind of figured out that like I don't have an art background and I don't like want to have an art background regarding always beyond actually like just visiting a museum for fun, that's when I was kind of steered more into archives and librarianship, just because I knew I loved books and I knew I loved history. And so actually getting into like the meta discussions of like, oh, how do archives actually run, and this is what's going on behind the scenes. I love the idea of taking someone behind the scenes and showing, okay, this is how it actually all really works.
I love that you mentioned the kind of pivoting from museums because of the lack of art background, because I literally, in some respects, was the exact opposite. I was first master's is in art history. So it was all art background. I can't make it, but I do like to talk about it. And in the process of doing my master's degree, I had to do archival research in a like medieval cathedrals archives. Highly recommend St. Albans in the UK if anyone ever gets a chance. Um, and I realized that one of my favorite things that I enjoyed about that experience was working with the archivist, learning more about the process, and learning just what was even available. Because, like many people, I hadn't had a lot of experience with some of these types of collections and such as an undergrad, and even pretty limited into my master's degree as well. So, for me, a lot of it is like Samantha and Melissa have both alluded to the idea of I like to give students the experience that I maybe didn't have. The other thing is I just think that archives are cool. There's so much interesting and unique stuff, and they're so diverse in terms of what they encompass and what they contain. And I think that it's really a resource that's kind of underutilized in a lot of courses and a lot of areas at times. And I think a big part of that is also just the intimidation factor. Um, People look at a book and they know what to do with it, or they think they know what to do with it. People look at an archival box and or they hear that they're going through like some, prestigious person's like correspondence and things like that. And I think a lot of people get very intimidated by that. And so a lot of doing archival literacy for me is one, making people, especially our students, aware of what's available, what they can learn from these types of materials, how they can use them themselves, but also trying to eliminate some of that intimidation by making it clear how you go about doing these things so that those questions don't prohibit them from doing stuff. And so really glad to see one, also other people doing so much fun work with this, but also personally working with colleagues here who were developing, workshops and different things like that to try and get that message out to even more people and in a broader context as well. Also, hi, Stephen, I see you on this call. Yeah, so I've kind of mentioned here that I obviously very academic library as are my colleagues, and I realize that this might not be relevant for some of our primary source instructors or people interested who maybe aren't working in the academic sphere. But a big question when it comes to a lot of these things, and we've kind of alluded to this in some respects, is how do you get buy-in from instructors or from administrators? Like, how do we go about getting people's interest and understanding about the need for these kinds of things as well? So if the panelists could kind of speak to that as well.
I think one way to get in buy-in, and this is very much due to a different like university culture. I know a lot of universities are very results driven. They want to see statistics, they want to see numbers. So trying to get administrators on board, if you can show them the numbers of students that you worked with, that's usually a driving factor. I think for instructors, it's a little bit different. You can play more to their heartstrings a little bit more and say things like, "This will be very enriching for your students." History students especially, but then of course students in other disciplines too. If you're able to connect whatever in your collection to the course that's being taught, would be a great thing too. I mean, I think if you have those different approaches for both for each group, I think that you could be more successful.
Like I said, the student interest alone is a huge, selling point for trying to get buy-in from administration. And when the head of our library and I approached our dean about wanting to just, have some space and some time in their schedule so that we could offer a workshop series, that we were approached by one of their doctoral students in Annenberg. Is a very small program, so there not a whole lot of course offerings all the time, and these are very high level student researchers. A lot of them are all TAs or they're teaching other classes. So we were getting students who were balancing multiple things, but they still had this interest in wanting to learn this. And so our dean gave us that green light. And when we opened it was January, we did just a blanket survey. Who would be interested in if we offered this workshop? What do you kind of want? And the fact that we had the 30 within 2 days already told our administration that there was obviously a need for some kind of literacy class like this at the Annenberg, that there's something missing from their core curriculum, that they felt that they wanted to add this into their schedule. And so they gave us wonderful resources. And in fact, I'm very pleased that they also bought us all lunch for every day of the workshop, because they're like, I know how to get students to butts and seats, is that you give them free lunch. And sure enough, we had our quota every week when we had lunches there as well. And then after we did another post survey kind of wrap up, and the feedback that we got from students that we could send on along to the dean. And again, the cases that these students got travel funds to continue their research outside of Annenberg and Penn was another huge selling point. And going forward, or I know we'll touch on this a bit more in some of these other questions, but they want us to now develop that workshop series into a full fall semester course for the doctoral students. So going from a 5 1-hour session to a weekly hour and a half, 2-hour seminar course for the Annenberg doctoral students on critical archival literacy. So obviously the feedback and the stakeholder buy-in worked really well. And so now I have a lot more on my plate for this upcoming semester.
I mentioned earlier a little bit of my motivation is promoting civic engagement, because it's just very important to me. And so that's an angle that I use when I'm trying to bring in classes from disciplines other than history. As Melissa mentioned, that's something that's very, very much worth doing because those disciplines really see primary sources and archives in different ways and can teach you about how to look at your own work and your own collections. So part of the way that I get buy-in is to look at, what is going to be motivating for these different disciplines about archival literacy. And something that I really can't explain, maybe a little paradoxical, is that when I propose archival literacy sessions, I'm usually asking for more than a one-shot. Because we'll get to this in another question, but it's tough to do in a one shot because if maybe they haven't had any primary source instruction, maybe they don't know how to handle a letter or what a letter is. So sometimes you have to have a little bit of extra instruction time to pull this off. So the paradox is, you wouldn't expect it, but sometimes I go to faculty and I say, well, we could do this in one session, or we could do this in 3 sessions. And some of them actually really like that idea. So I can't explain why, but it's an easy sell sometimes. Let's check back on that in a year or so after I've done this for a few more semesters, and maybe I'll have more of an idea of what's going on there. So that's buy-in. We intended to ask this question a little bit early. Some of you may have been wondering, okay, so what are you actually doing in these sessions? And so I'd like to hear from the panelists about some of the most important concepts that you include in an archival literacy session and the types of activities that you do in order to teach archival literacy.
So I mentioned in January, we sent out a survey to the Annenberg doctoral students just to kind of gauge their interest, their experience, and ask them what they wanted this kind of workshop series to look like. And what I found with that, the challenge is that their backgrounds and their disciplines and their interests are so varied that finding like a way to make a theme or something that might work for all of the students was going to be really difficult. But just some of the interests they had, journalism, philanthropy, and that's where we had the Rockefeller Archive coming in. So I wanted to be able to demo some sort of collection or some institution or some resource for each of their individual research interests. But like I said, it was so varied. So we did try to pick some highlights there, but the general interest from that survey was just kind of like a high level overview, how to approach archives as a researcher. A lot of them had noted that they hadn't been or they had no historical background, but they had that interest or that need to know. One had said the archive has always been a very obscure, vague concept to me. I'm hoping to get a concrete sense of what the archive is, how to find archives, and how to approach it generatively. I've never done archival work, no historical methods. I thought this could help me figure out how to get started. And so kind of looking at, some had a little bit of experience in the archives, but most of them did not, but had like an understanding that there is this idea of archives and that can be interpreted a lot of ways. And so we kind of built those 5 workshops based on that and kind of did high level ideas. And so for the first session, again, we did just an intro. I wanted to call it Archives 101 for the whole series, but I was told that the doctoral students would find that fundamentally offensive because they're doctoral students at this high level. So I couldn't use 101. And so we ended up calling it Introduction to Archival Methodology instead. And so we opened the session with just tell us about your research interests. Some were looking at community-based archives, social movements, platforms, religious apps, information disorders, archives and journalism, feminist protest theory, Black hair as language. And so it's like the gamut of types of interest. But then we started to identify and define all of the different ways, like archives the place, archives the stuff, archives these different types of contents. And kind of gave them a general overview of the Annenberg archives, of the archives that are here at Penn. Is just kind of a first session. The second one is where I kind of dove more into the arrangement and description and finding aids. So what I would do for, an archive student, it's like, here's these elements in a finding aid, here's your container guide, this is where these restrictions go, this is what it means, and where you would find this information in finding aids. And kind of open it up to questions for them. And then an activity was to send them to like a consortia site to go through finding aids and explain why this is a bad finding aid or how this is helpful or what questions do they have, seeing different types. And again, trying to take a global approach because their research is going all over the world. So not just institutions here in America, but institutions in Europe and in Africa and in Australia. And how do these look the same? How are they different? What principles kind of tie this all together? So I call that kind of anatomy of a finding aid and an exercise, which we always wrapped up each session with kind of a discussion. So the idea going in is that each workshop was 1 hour. We would do 30 minutes of me explaining these concepts, and then we would do some sort of activity and then follow it up with a 10-minute discussion. What we quickly realized was that was not near enough time because the discussion was always so wonderful that we just never got to the activity, but supposedly we were going to dissect some more finding aids for that one. For context and history, I kind of gave them an overview of how do you approach an archive? How do you reach out to an archivist? How do you approach community archives or personal archives and those different types of archival practices and theories behind the work that we do in the context of creating records. And then we were going to have them identify like a digital collection online or a community archive project and kind of do mini group work and presenting on those differences and how community archives are different than, you know, an institution like Annenberg's archives. The third one, we did research techniques and historical thinking, where we talked about reading for absence, reading for silence in historical records, reading against the grain, the production of archives and value. We looked at things like Zotero and Trophy, and each one of us, the head of the library, was also in these sessions sharing like our approaches for, you know, how you do research in an institution like this or in a historical society. And my background, I've worked in historical societies, private institutions, public institutions, so I was able to give them examples of how I've seen things go really, really well and really, really wrong, and how the different constraints of these types of archives kind of affect the work that can be done in those tools. We talked about how do you prepare for a visit, you know, make sure you bring a sweater. These archives are cold, like here, like just little things, because some of them have never done that kind of thing. So little things, extra chargers and cameras and things. And we had them open it up to share their experiences and their tips and research tricks. And then for that activity, we had them do like an Excel document, like make sure you grab the box number, the folder number, here's the fonts, here are my questions. Like you're going to see 1,000 documents in like a research day. Like how do you keep your mind around all of that information? And like I said, the last session, we looked at archival futures and ethics, and we pulled them on what they wanted to talk about. So for deaccession, repatriation, or reparative work, I pulled various case studies that are still very much in the news. The content warnings from the Library of Congress. We looked at the Harvard case of the photograph that the family wanted back from the slave, the photographer, and photographer's rights versus creators' rights versus the rights of the individuals in the photos. And so we were talking much more as an open discussion on what are these concepts, like what are the ethics behind, you know, custodial models and post-custodial models, and kind of where is the direction of archives going for the future. So that was kind of the logistics for that for the fall course. I'll touch on that in a little bit coming up, but basically we ran out of time in every single session. It was too much and too few sessions. So we're basically going to get to break that apart a lot more and dive into these concepts on a more granular level.
Oh,
Go
go ahead,
ahead,
Melissa.
Emily. Oh, I was just going to say, actually, Emily and I are contributing to a archives and primary source handbook. We'll probably speak a little bit more about that later on, but I just wanted to kind of introduce it because in this handbook, it's basically an archival literacy handbook where we talk about lesson plans, best practices on how to kind of implement these lesson plans. I find too that even in my own practice, I always start out as basic as I can, even just going over vocabulary words, because a lot of these students maybe don't even know what an archive is. They never heard the term finding aid. They just don't understand that they haven't been exposed to it, so they have no understanding. My colleague and I are actually working on an information literacy textbook that we're planning to have published next December. And the sections on it for history students actually do include some archival literacy. Something that Samantha said that she does in her series, we're talking about too, where we kind of just give the basics on like how to actually visit an archive. How do you contact an archivist, how can you get access to your archive, to an archive that might be in your local historical society or your local public library, and how to even just get started. So I find that, like, for me, that concept of like where to start, like where do you even start in all this, is something that I focus on in my archival literacy work.
Very, very similar for me to what Melissa just said. A lot of focusing on where do you get started, introducing like concepts and terms. One of the things that I find I try to do as much as I can when working with archival literacy and with primary source literacy in general is things like who is creating documents, the idea of the creator, this is it an organization? Is it a person? And also I think a lot of people in that mythical archives, when they're not super exposed to it, jump straight to, well, the archive has everything. And then I have a lot of students wondering why they can't find certain stuff or why certain things don't seem to be available. I mean, you have all of Ezra Cornell's personal papers. What do you mean that you don't have like everything he ever wrote? And so reminding people that these are items produced by and for humans, and humans don't always save everything. Humans don't have the same sense of what may or may not be important. And so getting them to understand that what's available is maybe not everything that you would hope to be available. In addition to kind of some of the, basics of archival literacy that people have touched on here. Also just reminding them that there's a lot of great things to be found, but also to not get super frustrated when you don't find stuff, or also to take a lot of things with a grain of salt. If you're reading someone's personal correspondence and they're talking about some event or things like that, remember that this is someone's personal correspondence. How they interpret the event, how they share information about it, could look very different from official accounts or other people's experience with it. So always be sure to like fact check and remember that biases do exist. Again, kind of going back to ideas of like archival silences, who do we collect? A lot of the material I'm going to have is going to come from very certain types of perspectives and not always going to have information as relevant to other perspectives. And that diversity of opinion is important for them to also recognize the difference.
And just to add a couple of activities that I like to do in, let's say, a one-shot, just to be really concrete about it, for those of you like me who sometimes attend these sessions and think like, I don't know how to apply this. I don't know. I just focus on boxes and folders. So, a typical primary source instruction session at my institution a couple of years ago might have been, we have 3 tables. Let's say the class has 15 students. We have 1 item at each seat. Each student gets an item, they look at it. So an adjustment that I've made to that lesson plan is to make sure that the item remains with its folder, and direct the student to the item first, and then to have them look at the folder as a whole, and then to bring out the box that the folder came from and have them look at the box as a whole, possibly compare it to the finding aid. So another adjustment that I like to make with that is that each table, the materials that are pulled are from one collection. So we ultimately end up with 3 different collections represented, and the tables can compare and compare notes on how those 3 collections are intertwined and how perhaps all 3 of them have material from one specific creator who's not actually named in any of the collections. So the students have a chance to discover how, if you're looking for something, you don't necessarily just look in the collection that's named for the person who is your subject, but you might look in the collections of the people who they corresponded with or who they worked closely with. Thank you, Emily, for giving me some time to answer that question. And I think I need to turn it back over to you.
Yeah, so I will also say for anyone who is interested in learning more about the Archives and Primary Source Handbook, I did drop a link in the chat to the publisher's New Prairie Press out of Kansas State University. It's going to be an open educational resource. The platform is still under development, but this can give you a little sense of what they're looking for. Also, they will most likely be looking for additional submissions to add to it. So if anyone's feeling real inspired, there you go. So yes, kind of moving along with our questions. So we've all kind of hinted a little bit at the fact that we, a lot of our motivation is access to these, creating a good experience for students. And just kind of wanted to open up to the panel on what feedback and responses have you received from students or from faculty and staff when you teach archival literacy?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, this was kind of the first time Annenberg had ever done something very specifically like this, but the engagement was wonderful. And like I said, every week, even though we ran out of time before we could ever get to the activities, like the discussions were wonderful with the students. And we did kind of a workshop recap at the end where we asked what elements were the most useful to you, and they appreciated the recommendations that we gave for how to conduct archival work, like bringing a sweater, bringing chargers, using, a phone stand to take pictures because it's faster than, scanners and other devices. They loved hearing our personal experiences in doing and researching, and how we kind of organize our materials and our informations. They found it useful to hear from the other experiences of other students in their cohort there who had done work in archives, and they enjoyed the discussions and the resources that I love the answer where it's everything, honestly. So I felt really good on the overall feedback. In terms of what they wanted to change, we kind of saw it coming. They're like, I would have appreciated longer sessions. We wanted practical things too, which again, the way we had designed it was to do kind of like 30 minutes of talk, like a lesson and some discussion and then an activity. We just never got to the activity part because the discussion part just was going so well. I didn't want to kind of interrupt that flow. So that was pretty much unanimous feedback, because they wanted more sessions. They wanted to go deeper into individual topics that we were discussing in terms of like privacy and copyright and rules, and like hearing from actual individuals creating, community archives, hearing other voices, because we were obviously very heavy on institutional archives and traditions, because that's my background and what I've done. So they wanted to kind of hear some other voices there in terms of what they wanted to see next time if we were offered was more case studies, more practical approaches. And they said, I think developing this into a full class would be great. And we did take that feedback to the dean, and that's what they're going to let us attempt to do this fall. And so basically I took that feedback to develop it's called Critical Archival Literacy. And it's going to be like a fall 2025 course if the faculty senate approves it. And what I did in terms of that is took the student feedback we've got there, and I kind of looked at the Society of American Archivists guideline for graduate archival education and used that to kind of lay out the different topics and themes and kind of what from an archivist education, pairs with these weeks. And then we're incorporating, they actually asked for readings. They're like, as much as I hate readings, it would have been helpful to kind of have some pre-readings before class discussions. So we're incorporating journal articles from media journals, from archival journals, and also just news stories, because this is journalism and communication. So archives in the news, quick reads that they can do on these topics into each week. And then we're also trying to incorporate guest speakers on like Community Archives Day. So can we get someone from, different organizations either around the globe or different digital projects to come in and talk about the issues or the concept for that week, and then trying to have at least a weekly activity, since we'll have a 2-hour block. We can do discussion and, a lesson kind of in an hour, and then an activity with the students there where they're actually building a research profile, writing a letter to an archivist for, travel grants, research grants, because I still want them to walk away from the course with something tangible that they can say, I built a digital collection, or I'm using this in my research for my dissertation defense coming up, or we got travel funds or something like that. So the feedback was insanely helpful. And obviously the staff and faculty here are very supportive of adding something like this. I think the feedback we got from faculty is that Annenberg offers a lot of quantitative research method type courses, but having something qualitative like this would pair well with their curriculum there. So it was overall a wonderful, positive experience, and I'm hopeful that going into the fall semester with this course that it's going to be as well received.
For me, I've gotten very positive feedback, especially from students. And one piece of feedback that I've gotten pretty much across the board from students and faculty too was like, wow, this is so cool. We had no idea these things existed, that our institution even had them. And we had some students had no idea that there's actually careers that you can actually make a career of being an archivist, and you could actually work in an archive as part of your daily job. So I like that kind of opening up of their horizons. That's mostly the feedback that I've gotten. In my new job, we are completely online. So when I kind of teach these archival concepts, they're more of like in the thinking realm, maybe not something they could do always in the same day, maybe on the spot. They could always try going to their local archives, but in terms of their classroom time, they can't do that because they're located all over pretty much. But still the feedback from the students have been the same, that the sense of like, I didn't even know these things existed, and it's really cool that they do, and that we could actually interact with them.
So I've gotten generally positive feedback from the faculty who have experienced this, these like, 3-course sessions. Although I do want to share, for everyone's benefit, the time that it didn't work out really well. It was one of the first times that I tried this, and this was in the class where the students are working on a semester-long project. So I've fortunately had the opportunity to refine this over the years, but my task, my very first time, was to prepare the students to actually use the archives for their research project. And I thought, well, they're going to be needing to look at finding aids and looking boxes and folders, so we'll do this activity where, they start with the item, and then they move to the folder, and then they go to the box and the finding aid, and it'll be great. They'll understand exactly how these collections are organized. What I did not prepare for was that the collections didn't actually have much more than the item that we had selected for them. So when it came time for the students to start to choose additional sources from the boxes that they were perusing, it just wasn't really working. They weren't finding things. So it turns out that we had really simulated the actual research experience quite well. As many of you know, that's how it goes sometimes. And researchers do need to be able to kind of get over that and keep going and persevere. But it was not the mood that I wanted to set for this class. So the room had started to get kind of anxious. I think the students were feeling responsible, that they weren't doing what I had asked of them. And that was totally my fault. Shouldn't have asked them to try to find something, should have just asked them to take a look, get a sense of it. Some good things that came out of that, though, were that the professor kind of stepped in to reassure the students by talking about her own experience doing research in archives, and really going into detail about how difficult it really can be in reality. And when the professor is sharing their own experience as an archival researcher, that's just a wonderful way for students to learn, because they're learning it from somebody who they already trust and who is already a part of their research community. So I was happy to see that happen. I think that we kind of righted the ship a little bit, and it has taught me to manage expectations. There are some faculty who, when you say students might get a little anxious during this activity, they're like, no, we don't want that. And then there are some who say, that's fantastic. That's what I want. So I am also careful about figuring out who this is going to work for, and where to not try it. So we've talked a little bit about doing archival literacy over the course of an entire semester. We've talked about doing it in a 3-course session, in a one-shot. In general, panelists, how much time do you need to, like at a minimum, to get these archival literacy concepts across? Can you do it in an hour?
Like I said, it's like depending on perhaps your faculty, your discipline, or the target research level of the students, maybe. But I know for what the students asked of us, there was no way we were going to be able to cover reading against the grain and archival authority and all of these high level concepts on a global scale, not just here in, the United States and here at Penn and in Pennsylvania, as they wanted to look at all these other concepts based on their own research interests. And it's just not something we were going to be able to cover in an hour, or even, as I said, 5 different sessions, that if they wanted to have those in-depth discussion about rights and about cultural memory and communication as it relates to archival literacy, that we were going to need a lot more time. That said, since a lot of these students are also TAs, and we do have undergraduate Annenberg students here, there might be, what we're talking about is doing some sort of archives month programming in the fall that could be open up to something other than just the archival or the doctoral students here. So if we narrow down to a very specific component of the archival literacy, like community archives or something like that, we could probably do it in like a discussion type workshop, a day workshop, or even just an evening kind of session if we bring in like a guest speaker to discuss with an open kind of forum on a single part of the archival literacy. That might be work, and that's something that we're kind of looking at to pilot as part of Archives Month programming. But in terms of a very critical look at archives and archival literacy, we're shooting for the full semester, with a lot more time for activities and discussions and getting engagement from the students there.
I would say that for us, I'm getting more and more success with getting more than an hour. I don't know how other people feel about the likelihood of faculty to relinquish more than one of their sessions to you. But much like Jill pointed out, kind of the paradox of they'll push back on certain things, but then when you tell them we can do this over 3 sessions, they'll be on board. And I think it's also comes down a lot to obviously who your faculty is. But I will say that I see a lot of emerging trends from faculty, at least here at Cornell, that are interested in having the students work with archives, learn more about them, and realize that these resources are available. So there's been a lot more flexibility and a lot more willingness to kind of give that time. If I'm shooting for my best case scenario, though, most semesters, it's usually about 2 sessions. And hopefully the sessions that are about an hour and 15 minutes long, as opposed to the 50-minute class sessions. I found that those give us enough time to kind of talk through some basics, as well as give the students a chance to, kind of get their hands dirty in a metaphorical sense. I promise I make them wash their hands before they touch things. But then it gives us an opportunity to space out a session later in the semester where the students get to select some material on their own, have to use the principles that they learned in the first session, and then we bring them back into the classroom space so that they can work with the materials and how they might relate back to the project that they're working on for class, or whatever it is that they're supposed to be, gaining from this as part of the curriculum. There's give and takes on how well that works. It's a lot of front-loaded planning on our team's part to make sure everything's paged and ready, and that the students are getting requests submitted in a timely enough fashion that I can actually get them here in time. We do have off-site storage, so some things take a little bit to get here. But I have found that the students do have like a really high sense of engagement then when they've been able to find their own things, and also they get to kind of pick. It's a lot more fun for them in some respects than me trotting out things that have been decided by them and their professor. Well, me and their professor. So that ownership of it is also really helpful. And so I think that finding a way to incorporate that does help. But usually I got to have at least 2 sessions to make that a reality. Ideally, it would be more like 3 or 4, but I also have very limited number of rooms and a limited number of space. So also have to work within parameters of what I logistically can do with the spaces that I have too.
For me, it's pretty similar to I would like to have more than one session at an hour. That would be ideal. But however, if you're going to make me do it in an hour, I will get it done. I think also we probably all have had these experiences too, where faculty will come in and use the library almost like a filler or even like a babysitter kind of hour, where they say like, okay, I'm going to be out this day, so I'm just going to send the students to the library. You do what you want, whatever. And I think in that instance, when you're only given that little bit of time and the faculty member isn't even really engaged, if you try to make the impression, like a good impression on the students and to get good feedback from them, that could lead to having more sessions down the line. But I know space is limited, time is limited. So if I, most of the time in my experience, I would only get that hour, but I would try to make it count as much as I could.
So kind of with the playing off the idea of how much time do you need is also how well can you do this if you don't have in-person availability of spaces or resources. So again, opening up, what are the pros and cons of doing things in person? What are the pros and cons of things online? What kind of experiences have you all had with that?
So the way we did it, because there are so many events and like workshops, and I swear there's so many luncheons catered here at Annenberg that I'm competing with, that we offered it as a hybrid model. And for them to, we called it micro credentialing, where if they attended, 4 out of the 5, we would give them like a certificate of like they did some archives literacy workshop series. The hybrid model was tough. Like I said, I teach arrangement and description for North Texas, and that's fully online, and it's kind of built that way, and we have the discussions, and everyone has like an understanding, and they can kind of flex the time and things that way. But doing it as a hybrid, just our setup in the room, it was awkward because it's kind of like just a seminar little forum. We're sitting in a half circle talking, and then I've got a screen behind me, so I've got like my back to them, and I'm trying to like make sure that they're included in the discussions, and it didn't quite work. And most of them were either, I'm staring at a screen of black boxes on my screen right now, so it was really hard to gauge whether they were involved or engaged with it. And the ones in the room, it was wonderful discussion. So I think either doing it as a fully online or an in-person thing would have worked better. And so going forward, we are going to do the full in-person, because the way some of the activities I want to do with them would involve like doing small groups and then like coming back together, and you just get to share more and kind of get the feel of the room. And if this activity is not working, how can we like flip it real quick, or like this discussion's kind of like going a different direction, let's go there. So like I said, it probably depends on your setup, but I did find like trying to do it both ways and to try and meet all the needs all the time was really, really challenging.
I have experience doing both in person and online, thanks in part to the pandemic, and then also my current job. For my previous job, we, of course, started out in person, and actually 3 months into my new job is when the pandemic started. So I only had about 1 or 2 sessions, I think, when I first started in person, these in person teaching sessions. And so I had to pivot to online really quick. I found for me a great way to do it was actually through Zoom. I would do it in kind of like a webinar mode. I would show photos of the objects. Of course, the downside to that is the students couldn't actually touch them, but I would try to describe the objects as best that I could. Something even like turning the pages of something so students can hear the age in the paper is one thing that I found that the students actually really liked. And right now, my current job, we are a completely online library. So I have never actually worked with any students in person. It's always been 100% over Zoom. Since we're completely online, and also we don't have a ton of history majors and no history graduate students, a lot of what I talk about with these students is very meta. We talk about the concepts and how to do it in person if they do find themselves doing research in their public library or in another local archive or other local institution. So I found, at least for me, going online, that all of the concepts become very meta in that sense that it's down to concepts. But when you're in person, there's more action to it. The students can actually see that the object is actually right in front of them and does exist. So those are the two main differences that I found, at least in my experience.
Melissa, I think I'll be reaching out to you at some point to talk more about online instruction, because it sounds like you're a great resource for that. I have not had many opportunities to try online, but I was reflecting on an activity that I did in the Queer Archives undergraduate course, where I wanted to introduce the concept of series and arrangement to students. So I at first thought, oh, I could have some things for them to arrange. Wouldn't that be great? In person in our classroom. And then I realized like, oh, the classroom is like 3 hours from our repository and we don't even bring stuff outside of the room most of the time. So what will I do? And I turned to their personal Google Drives. So we just had a quick activity, 10 or 15 minutes in class, where I asked students to look at their Google Drives and propose a series arrangement. And I found that that was actually quite effective when the students shared out, that I could tell that they had understood the concept of what series are, and that they were able to compare their series to other people's series. So I can see that working fairly well in a virtual environment, especially if it were an asynchronous virtual environment. And so that's really all I have to contribute to that final question. So we've gone a little bit over time with our panel portion of this session. And we're just so excited that there are so many people in the audience who joined us to talk about and learn about this topic. We did think about sharing resources for learning more about archival literacy. Emily and Melissa mentioned the resource that they had worked on. And of course, there are many, many papers and articles and other resources about this topic. But I think